Hello, everyone. Welcome to our debate. My name is Blair Hollifield. I'll be guiding us along as we debate the use of restraints and seclusion for people with ASD and other developmental disabilities. Emily Hahn, Caitlin O'Leary, Hannah McKinney, Candace Dixon, and Junalyn Gabrielle de la Cruz are all members of our debate tonight. Emily Hahn is the illustrator. Hannah McKinney will be arguing for the use of restraints and seclusion. Candace Dixon will be arguing against the use of restraints and seclusion. And June is the summarizer, and Caitlin is the fielder for our debate. The use of restraint or seclusion to manage aggressive behavior for an individual with ASD has its benefits and disadvantages. Regardless, it is controversial and can raise ethical concerns. If you provide ABA services to individuals with severe problem behaviors, I believe this debate will speak to you and the way you conduct your work. As behavior analysts, we must abide by the BACB Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. As we go through our debate, I encourage those of you who are watching to refer to our Professional and Ethical Compliance Code throughout, and this code promotes the use of the least restrictive procedures possible. However, some in our field find the use of restraints or seclusion absolutely necessary to prevent self-injurious behaviors or harm to others. So these are some definitions that we felt would be necessary to provide in order to discuss this topic. Physical restraint is any method of one or more persons restricting another person's freedom of movement, physical activity, or normal access to his or her body. Mechanical restraint entails the use of any device or object to limit an individual's body movement to prevent or manage out-of-control behavior. Seclusion is defined as the involuntary confinement of an individual alone in a room or area from which the individual is physically prevented from leaving. Okay, so before we get into our arguments, June is going to give us some background on our topic. June?
Alrighty. Restraint and seclusion have been a controversial topic from the beginning. The use of these methods are only to be used in emergency situations and are not to be used as behavioral techniques to change behavior. The Children's Health Act of 2000 and IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, were already in place. To give a little bit overview of the Health Act of 2000, it was amended Title V of the Public Health Service Act to regulate the use of restraints and seclusions on residents of certain hospitals and healthcare facilities that receive any type of federal funds, as well as on children in certain residential, non-medical, community-based facilities that receive funds under the Public Health Service Act. IDEA requires that eligible students be educated in the least restrictive environment, and it also mandates that special education students have an individualized education program, or IEP. On July 31, 2009, Orrin Duncan, who was the Secretary of Education, was highly concerned of the use of restraint and seclusion in schools nationwide that were abusive. Many of the application of restraint and seclusion led to negative consequences such as death. Duncan recommended all chief state school officers to review and revise policies and guidelines regarding restraint and seclusion. He also encouraged the use of behavioral interventions such as PBIS, which is positive behavior intervention and supports. The Department's Office of Civil Rights also revised their data collection starting from the year 2009 to 2010. The Civil Rights of Data Collection was required to report the total number of students under the protection of the IDEA who were present during occurrences of restraint and seclusion. So here's a little visual of how many students were under the restraint and seclusion. The U.S. Department of Education created a resource document in regards to restraint and seclusion that includes principles that were also expressed by Duncan. The 15 principles are provided as a framework for states, districts, and schools in developing and implementing policies. The goal of the principles is to create a safe learning environment for all students. In 1997, OSCP, the Office of Special Education Programs, funded the Technical Assistance Center on PBIS. It led to SWPBIS school-wide, which is another framework that involves evidence-based practices for behavioral interventions for all students. Its core principles are consistent with the 15 principles provided by the Department of Education. Duncan encouraged the use of PBIS first instead of resorting to restraint and seclusion as the first procedure to use in students. On May 2009, the United States Government Accountability Office found that there were no federal regulations related to restricting the use of restraints in public and private schools. Rather, they found state laws that were varied or lacked commonality. They examined allegations in cases of abuse and death of children, that is displayed in this visual, subjected to restraint and seclusion. In particular, with ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International strongly opposed the unnecessary and inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion. Consistent with their 1989 position statement on the right to effective behavioral treatment, the guiding principles regarding restraint and seclusion include the welfare of individuals served in the highest priority. Individuals and parents or guardians have a right to choose, and the principle of least restrictiveness. Determining the use of restraint and seclusion must be considered based on the adherence to the ethical codes, including, for example, 2.05 rights and prerogatives of clients and 4.09 least restrictive procedures. For other settings, such as schools, hospitals, and other organizations that provide human services, more and more state legislations require employees staffed in these settings to be trained in reducing or eliminating restraints and or preventing and managing crisis. Some of examples of organizations that provide these trainings include Crisis Prevention Institute and Professional Crisis Management Association.
All right, thank you, June. Hannah will now discuss why restraints are necessary in the field of ABA.
Okay, so restraints have been used in many different settings for decades. Restraints have been used in residential facilities, schools, and hospitals. There was a study conducted in Pennsylvania to review the safety of restraint. It was by Tilly and Sprett. There was 157 participants that were diagnosed with autism, ODD, ADHD, and they all had things that impeded their daily life. In 2009, there was 1,325 restraints applied to these 157 participants. 15% of those reports failed to report if an injury occurred, but the remaining 85% of those restraints reported resulted in injury only 33% of the time. 99% of those injuries were minor. There were no deaths, there were no broken bones, chipped teeth, or even breathing complications reported. This study provided us with information on if staff members are adequately trained, there should be less injuries that occur. Also, restraint was only used when the resident or others were in immediate danger. Restraint should be very clearly defined on what should happen before implementing. With adequate training, restraint can be safe. Another definition that we've already covered is seclusion. It can be defined in multiple ways. It can be placing a child in an empty room with the door locked, or it is better defined by the separation of one child from a group setting. The best form of seclusion and successful intervention is timeout. If a client enjoys their environment, it may serve as a punishment to remove them from a preferred environment. The Association of Behavior Analysis International posted a statement about restraint and seclusion. They strongly oppose the use of restraint and seclusion if the use of procedures are unnecessary. But they, however, do agree that restraint and seclusion are useful in crisis management procedures to maintain safety. A study conducted by Wallace and his colleagues did a study on mechanical restraints for the treatment of self-injurious behaviors. The use of mechanical restraints can restrict adaptive behaviors. So when using mechanical restraint, it's very important to focus on that fading process. But in their study, there were 2 participants in the study that were in a residential facility that engaged in high-intensity self-injurious behaviors. The SIB was head and face hitting. So an adaptive behavior that they did in the study was drinking. They conducted a restraint analysis on how many stays to place into a sleeve. The stays were metal stakes placed into a sleeve put on their arms. They conducted the restraint analysis to see how many stays would be needed. They were exposed to 3 times to the sequence of conditions. So they were baseline with no restraint sleeves without stays, and then a condition with restraints with 5 up to 25 metal stays in their sleeves. 3 to 9 sessions were conducted daily on these participants, and they found that the restraint use decreased SIB even with fewer metal stays. However, there was not very much detail on follow-up procedures for these participants. In Tomprowski's research study, the participant in the study engaged in high-intensity disruptive behavior that interfered with the skills being worked on by a therapist. So they implemented a 2-trainer procedure for brief restraint. The primary trainer used prompting strategies such as verbal, gestural, or physical prompting, and the second trainer implemented a response-contingent restraint of movement. The procedure immobilized the participant's arms and movement of the body. The primary trainer would then stabilize the legs during the procedure. The duration of immobilization was no longer than 60 seconds anytime they had to implement. The results of this study the results of this study showed less disruptive behavior during acquisition targets. They had a section where they did a fading portion of the study, and even when the second trainer faded completely out of the room, the client still did not engage in high-intensity disruptive behaviors. These studies discussed here support restraint by reducing maladaptive behavior, and it gave more opportunity for these participants to focus on acquisition targets.
During emergency situations, the use of restraints can become necessary. The 3 restraints shown in this bar graph by Weber, McVilly, and Chan 2011 are chemical, mechanical, and seclusion, as well as the reasons for these restraints, which are limited to harm to self, other, or property. When restraining individuals, it is recommended by the ABAI in 2010 to consult medical professionals as well as BCBAs when establishing when restraint is necessary. ABAI also points out that restraints are only used when absolutely necessary, when the behavior has become dangerous and the individual is no longer safe to themselves, with property, or others, and the benefit of restraint outweighs the harm it may cause the individual. There are several benefits to restraints, including keeping the individual and others around them safe. One type of restraint, seclusion, can offer time for the individual to practice self-coping skills in order to de-escalate on their own, or to practice being able to reach out to the individual around them to identify why they escalated and some different ways they could handle the situation they found themselves in. These talks are best done once the individual is calm and able to respond in a low voice with minimal tears.
All right, Hannah and Emily, thank you. You guys made some great points regarding the safety of restraint and seclusion, how it can be used, and the benefits that have been determined through research. So now we're going to move on to Candace, who will be arguing against the use of restraints and seclusion.
The University of Texas completed a study on eliminating the use of restraints and seclusion against students with disabilities. Most teachers and other school personnel believe that there is a need to seclude or restrain children who are at risk of property destruction or harm or imminent danger to themselves or others within the building. Teachers and other school personnel report that the use of physical restraint to prevent harm has been reported to be beneficial to the other individuals within the classroom. However, there is almost no research to support the use of physical restraint and/or seclusion to prevent or reduce behaviors. Additionally, there is no evidence to support the environment of a seclusion room or the amount of time students should spend in these rooms. School personnel, however, still feel that to keep students safe, that they need to restrain or seclude them. The use of physical restraint can also cause harm by physical and emotional harm to both parties involved. A student in West Virginia reported being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after being physically restrained to a chair. A student in Atlanta hanged himself in a seclusion room and died after and another student died after being pinned down for several hours by 7 school personnel. Students who did not have any physical harm to report shared that they had nightmares, fear, and increased psychological harm to children who have not experienced prior abuse. The National Disabilities Rights Network documented incidents from all 50 states, indicating that students with disabilities were being abusively pinned to the floor for hours at a time, handcuffed, locked in closets, and subject to other traumatic acts of violence. According to a study conducted by the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, 71% of the 185 cases studied did not use any form of positive behavioral supports as an intervention. The Child Welfare League of America has estimated that between 8 and 10 children in the U.S. die each year due to restraint procedures. According to the United States Department of Education, physical restraint or seclusion should not be used except in situations where the child's behavior poses imminent danger of serious physical harm to self or others, and restraint and seclusion should be avoided to the greatest extent possible without endangering the safety of students and staff. Schools should never use mechanical restraints to restrain a child's movements. Over 17,000 schools across the country are implementing PBIS, which is a positive behavior intervention system, which provides a framework for decision-making that guides the implementation of evidence-based academic and behavioral practices throughout the entire school, frequently resulting in significant decrease in behavioral referrals without having to use restraint or seclusion.
The BACB Ethical Code revised in 2014 has 3 different codes that I've identified that restraint goes against. The first of which is 2.09, Treatment/Intervention Efficiency, which discusses in Section D that any treatment that affects the behavior change plan should be considered carefully, while in earlier Section A, it is said that the client has a right to an effective treatment. When being restrained, the individual can be limited in what they will be able to participate in for behavior changes, making it hard to be able to implement the behavior change plan. The next BACB ethical codes, 4.08, considerations regarding punishment, advises that all reinforcement type procedures are tried before trying any type of punishment procedure like restraint, or even when punishment procedures is put in place, it should be followed by a reinforcement and then the training of staff to avoid the punishment procedure again, restraints, which can be hard for staff to implement after a restraint procedure is used, because restraint procedures are used after a situation where the individual has caused harm to themselves, others, or property. It can be difficult for staff to separate themselves from this situation that has just occurred. The final ethical code from the BACB in 2014 is 4.09, Least Restrictive Procedure, which is just the behavior analyst ensuring the least restrictive procedure is utilized. This ethical code is important. Restraints are not the least restrictive for individuals when there are several different types of reinforcement procedures and hundreds of different ways to present these procedures. ABAI in 2010 discusses that crisis management procedure are not to be used as a replacement for behavioral treatment, which can be difficult if proper behavioral treatment procedures are not available for different reasons, or staff is not accurately trained to implement the behavior treatment, or are not trained properly on situations where and how to verbally just de-escalate the individual before the situation reaches this level.
All right, thank you, Candace and Emily, and thank you everybody for your work on this debate. There are many questions that can be asked about this topic, so Caitlin is going to present some of those questions now.
Okay, so the first question is, a lack of training is a potential issue for those who perform restraints. Are there any strategies or methods that can help improve training for administering restraints and or decrease the need for restraints? Yes, the proactive strategies should always be used first to de-escalate the situation before restraint is considered. We always want to use the least restrictive procedures, and so we always want to try to use the preventative or proactive strategies first. A plan should always be in place so that the team knows what to do in a given circumstance. And in the rare occasion that a restraint is required, the individual could refer to the decision tree during crisis situations. It's outlined in the article, Ethical and Professional Guidelines for the Use of Crisis Procedures. The tree is on the left or on the right side, and it describes what should be done. So, like the first question is, does behavior prevent immediate danger? And then you just go down from there if it's yes or versus no. So it walks through what should be done and depending on the response to the question. And then another suggestion would be to review the situation once the crisis is over and to make changes or discuss what can be done differently in the future to prevent the need for restraint. This is a good way to monitor each situation to better prepare for the future. So there is a figure up there, and it is also from the Ethical and Professional Guidelines for the Use of Crisis Procedures. It's something that you use after a crisis, and so you go through the checklist to determine if the restraint was worth it, like you got, or
Necessary
to monitor it. Yeah. Like, oh, where is it? It can be done differently, or if the BSP needs to be updated. So the monitoring system in place can help change future outcomes and help examine the fidelity of the staff. And then it can also, for training in general, there's not an exact amount of time between the initial and the refresher courses for something like CPI or PCM. But an article from the Crisis Prevention states that the state and regional and local policies have the jurisdiction over that. So each state can decide. And for where I work at the school district in Kansas, their policy says that for a refresher for the de-escalation procedures, we have to have every other year. And then for the physical restraints, we have to have every year. And that's the formal training. So, and then Crisis Intervention Institute also suggests that not all trainings need to be a formal setting either. The CPI trainer can come at any time and go over general training and specific interventions as often as needed. So to the side is a table showing what types of trainings there are. So the formal training, that's where you take your test and you go through and you get a booklet and stuff. And then anytime that you need a review or don't know how to use something, because we don't always use these procedures, let's say you get a new kid and there's different procedures that needed to be used, you can always call somebody out and they can come out and give you a refresher course. Okay, so for question number 2, it's the use of restraint and seclusion vary from setting to setting. For example, in Indiana, mechanical restraints are not recommended to be used for people in adult services. Is it ethical to use this as a way to address behavior if it is not something that can be used across various settings? And what happens if a child uses a mechanical restraint in one setting, but then moves to a new setting where that type of restraint is not allowed? The crisis procedures should be discussed with the caregiver, and they should be informed on what procedures are different, especially if the original plan was successful in protecting the individual. They should be completely informed and making decisions or be informed before making the decisions to change the setting. Each state has different laws regarding seclusion and restraint, so the legislation and the policies for the program or school should always be followed. If an intervention procedure is not allowed, then it should not be performed, unless given specific instruction to do so per the individual. Since the rules on seclusion and restraint are not equal, it would not be right to say that since one place doesn't allow it, then nobody can use it. Crisis procedures are used to prevent injury in an unsafe situation and not to be used as a behavioral reduction tool. And so the reasons why the company/school doesn't recommend or allow could be due to a factor of things. These could include low staff, untrained staff, or inaccessible to mechanical devices, and many other factors. So the type of intervention should be individualized to the person's needs while still following the policy. And then question 3 is, do you have any personal experience related to the topic that you'd like to share? And yes, I have been in the field for about 6 years now. I worked in the clinical and public school settings, both using methods of seclusion and restraint. In the clinical setting, only supervisors and support staff were trained in PCM. And so I was just working with a student and I was not trained. So if I was ever in a situation, all I had to do is say support and where I was, and typically somebody would always be there within seconds. They would always try de-escalation procedures, and then if needed, they could go to restraint or transport to a safe room. But now that I'm in a school setting now, and it's really different, we use CPI, and I'm RBT now, so all RBTs are required to be trained. When we get called to a school, it's typically for emergency situations, for kids that have extreme like aggression or self-injurious behaviors. So I've been in many situations where seclusion and restraint are necessary, but it's not only necessary for the safety of the child, but it's the safety of the staff and the other students in the classroom. I do support seclusion over restraint because it means I don't have to put hands on a child, and it limits the possibility of injury compared to getting closer to a child that's aggressing. The only time I've had to restrain a child is when self-injury was causing physical damage. Also, to note, parents can send, for my school district, parents can send things in like helmets and gloves, and that's considered a mechanical restraint, but if they send it in, we're allowed to use it. But we cannot suggest or provide equipment for other students.
All right, so these are our references. We'll post these below our debate video. So we're done. Thank you all so much for viewing our debate, and thank you to my fellow group members for their work on this debate.